Yeah. So welcome again to the Trainer podcast, in which I try to bridge the gap between science and practice in the fields of first responders. Today I'm talking about the visual system with Dr. Murray. He's a professor in the Department of the difficult word kinesiology. Can you please help me?
Kinesiology, yeah.
Kinesiology. This is performing under pressure at East Carolina University. And his recent work includes factors that influence visual expertise in officers when they encounter a threat or potential threat, and the role of the physiological arousal on visual search during a high-stress, high-threat, and use of force scenarios. And Dr. Murray authored, together with Dr. Lewinsky and others, two articles I'd like to talk about. And that is the latest one, The Eyes Have It, Functional Field of View Difference between Visual Search Behavior and Body-worn Camera during a use of forced response in active duty police officers. It seems to me, as a layman, a very important article about the difference between what you see on video and what officers perceive. And then there was the study Gaze Control and Tactical Decision Making Under Stress. So, Dr. Murray, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Glad you. Well, there is a lot. Can we first take a little bit of a broad picture about the visual system and performance? And I'm not sure if I'm correct, but in one of the papers you also talk about the integrative model of stress and attention. I'm not sure if that helps in describing the visual system, but
yeah. So basically, we look at vision as an indication of state, and our kind of general guiding principles or thesis was to see, in looking at that model, there's effectively two pathways that someone can go down, and one is where they see a situation as a response to their training and their tactical knowledge, things like that, and so they see it as a challenge. And when they see it as a challenge and some representation of their competence, then that changes their visual behavior, it changes their stress response, and it changes their outcomes. When someone sees it as what we call a threat, and these situations with police are always a threat, but it's how they perceive it as a threat, and basically a threat to their ego, threat to their overall safety, and a threat to whether they feel like they are competent in that situation, then that elicits a very different visual behavior, and it elicits a different stress response, and typically outcomes are a lot worse, and they typically make more errors, make some decision making, or delayed in response, things like that. And so the biggest idea is that the biggest thing that changes in visual behavior is that scan rates, or what number of places you look over a period of time, will be much lower when the world is a representation of your competence and whether you see it as a challenge. And you tend to have a lot more scanning behavior when you see it as a threat. So you scan the environment a lot more. And what's interesting, what's counterintuitive about that is if I look around more places, if I'm scanning the environment more, I tend to miss key pieces of information. But actually, I'm holding my gaze steady and sort of broadly scanning it to some degree, then I will tend to see more information. So it's kind of counterintuitive because I gather more information when my eyes are more still, right? When they move less. Not to say they don't move at all, because you have to be very tactical and very pointed about where you look in the visual world. But we want to try to minimize the number of places we look to that. And of course, it goes tied back to tactical training. The better trained I am, the better I know where and when to look and how to. And what are the key pieces of information that's in the visual world that I need to process and do something about?
Is this solely dependent upon experience? Where to look?
Yeah, experience, but more importantly, having probably more better tactical training, better types of training, more integrated training, where we are so we can utilize that training in the real world, so we can tie that back to the real world. So some more like specificity of learning where that training is usable in that way. So, because in the first article that we did, one of the interesting things is time on force wasn't a factor in the outcomes that we saw. So what was a factor was having more and better tactical training was a factor.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. And so, a little bit zooming out for a moment before we go to the articles.
Sure.
The visual system, can you, how does it work? I'm not meaning on a very brain level, but I heard Andrew Huberman talk about the eyes as being parts of the brain. What is going on in what is the actual model of explaining
Yeah, sure.
what we see, what we perceive?
Right. So, so we look at the ways it's perception and action. So your perception, your understanding the meaningfulness of the environment drives your action, right? And so having better perceptual knowledge improves the action that you take. And we see it is sort of cyclical. So you take some action that changes your perception, then you take some action, and so that's that whole learning process. And so, so it's largely context driven. So by understanding the context or the patterns in the environment, the better we can make decisions and have better outcomes. And so we see, and I say we because talk about my lab and my colleagues that we look at this. The way the visual system works is that when we are under higher stresses environments, we tend to narrow our visual field to to narrow our focus. When we're under lower stress, we tend to widen our focus. And in any given environment, there's both relevant information and irrelevant information. And typically speaking, we want to focus in on relevant information and utilize that relevant information in order to make better decisions, have better outcomes, perform better. We tend to try to ignore irrelevant information. And so when we're under higher stress, we can either fixate too much on irrelevant information, or we fixate on one piece of relevant information, meaning missing other pieces of relevant information. So, and largely what we see is that the world is a series of patterns, and the more we can recognize those patterns, the better we're going to make those decisions in a particular environment. And so there's sometimes those patterns are defined by physics and the nature of the environment. Other times it's patterns that we see in based on some rule-based situations, like you might find driving a car in a particular country where they have certain rules that you have to drive a certain way. And other times we have patterns based on our expectations of human behavior, right? Yeah. And so recognizing what those patterns might be helps us regulate and make better decisions. And so the visual system is the guide into which that happens, and so drives the rest of those functions.
And is the visual system, because of muscles, I learned that muscles are stupid. It's the brain that, how do you call it? Gives the order, so to speak.
Yeah,
the eyes themselves, is it true for the eyes themselves? Are they a little bit stupid, so to speak? Or?
Yes, the muscles just drive positions, and we get feedback for whether our head is moving versus whether our eyes are moving, and so we see those circular loops there without getting too much into the neuro anatomy of it all. But it is driven by it's all driven by the brain, and so where our vision goes drives it. Now it is also stimulus driven too, right? So the things in the world, if the stimulus is intense or changes or something like that, then it's going to drive our vision to it. So there's this relationship between the stimuli that are in the world plus our own processing that we have with it. So, and we always look at as eye movements. So we study a lot of eye movements, and we look at those typically in relationship to attention. So where your eyes go, attention typically follows. It is true that you can divorce yourself of, like I could be daydreaming or something like that and thinking about something, and my eyes would be forward, and my focus is really inner, and rather than outer to some stimuli outside. However, when we do our studies and we look at it, we typically look at environments where the task that the environment is driving where your eyes go, therefore driving where your attention goes. So in order to be successful in that task, you have to give it attention. And so we sort of couple those two things together with the recognition that they can be uncoupled, right? So
And if the how do you call it? How do you, I saw recently I saw a TED talk by Lisa Feldman Barrett about, I think she said that what you see is what you feel. I'm not sure the correct sentence, but it went along the way that your affectional state of your body also, like the embodiment, plays a role in what you see.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And that's one thing we started to dabble into a little bit with the police work that we're doing, is to try to look at emotional regulation. And so that's exactly what we're talking about. So we see these emotionally charged situations, events, those type of things. They will then drive our behavior, particularly our motor behavior, in a way. And so using vision as a sense to regulate emotion
Yeah.
is possible, right? And so even just worrying about how to control vision actually will lower that heightened emotional state that someone might be in.
Yeah.
You know, even though the visual system is seeing this emotionally charged event, and we can mitigate that a little bit by just managing our visual system.
And is it also true that you can by deliberately how do you call it, use your visual system, for example, to look at a horizontal, how do you call it, horizon or whatever? Can you deliberately use your eyes and what you see to calm yourself down?
Yeah, generally speaking, you can. Yeah, so you can, and doing something to try to like widen your field of view, relax your
Yeah.
visual system a little bit will help with that process. You know, and of course, like if you're looking at a horizon of a beautiful scene, something like that, you know, that visual input is going to, you know, so depending on what the stimuli is, it will initiate or help calm someone down. But trying to manage the visual system either way will either increase stress response. You know, if I'm worried and I'm stressed, I start looking in more spaces. If I'm controlling it better, trying to do planned movements, that will actually lower their stress response. If I'm trying to, you know, just totally relax myself, I might, you know, widen my visual field and then, you know, relax myself in a way like that. So yeah, so how I look at the world can definitely influence my emotion, both my emotional regulation and my stress response, which
Yeah.
of course are coupled and tied together. So
And
yeah,
because in military and police there is a procedure called scan and breathe, and
yes.
we did it, of course, in the first place for operational reasons to
Right.
scan around for threats.
Mhm.
But later on, I thought, well, you can also use it as a surgeon if you're feeling yourself, you know, like a tunnel vision, and maybe just soften your vision or what broaden your vision. Maybe it gets some more.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um, is
yeah.
there
So you,
physiological yeah, how do you call it, rationale for this?
sure, absolutely. Yeah. So we do see that in, you know, if we can do things to uh like you say, soften our vision, or to know that you're under us, you know, your eyes are moving too fast. So by slowing down your visual scans, by taking longer fixations, you're going to change your affective state. You know, you're going
Yeah.
to lower your affective state. But it is you know, if we do it too broad, like if we go too far, you know, particularly in a situation where we need to be focused, you know, so you
Yeah.
can go too far, right? You can go too far the other way. So it is a bit curvilinear in the
Yeah.
relationship. So like if we're really high stress, we tend to have lots of eye movements, tend to miss important information. If we're really low stress, the other end, or really fatigued, you know, if we really take it to that arousal state, we tend to have this really broad focus, and it's hard to pay attention to anything at all.
Yeah.
It's hard to focus in on everything, you know.
Yeah.
It's like the idea of sitting on the beach on a beautiful sunny day when you don't have a care in the world. You know, someone could walk by you and you wouldn't even know that they walked by you, because you just sort of, you know, and your eyes are open. They can even walk in front of your visual field,
Yeah.
and you're not actually paying attention to who that person is. And, you know,
Yeah.
the friend walks up and they say, "Hey, why don't you say hi?" I'm like, "I didn't even see you there," you know. And so in that case, you're too broad,
Yeah.
particularly in a tactical situation. And we see that in fatigue,
Mm.
specifically in fatigue. We'll see that in some of the studies we've done where someone was really fatigued. We see that they miss critical pieces of information. They do poor on it. Their eyes don't move. They move a lot more with a lot more variability to them in that fatigue state. So when we have them move around and look at visual fixation points, we see lots of variability in the way their eyes move. Where someone's in sort of the middle, we see a very planned approach to it. And with some variability, and then we see a lot less variability when we see them in a really high stress state. So we see this sort of relationship. Yeah.
One last question before I want to ask you about your latest article is there an ideal scan behavior in the sense that in a scan behavior that is the best in all situations? I mean,
Yeah. Not necessarily in all situations, but like, I think it's very task dependent. So we can come up with different types of scan behavior that would be better in certain situations and others that would be better in other situations. And an easy example of this is to look at, like, say, for example, sport. And so if we have a sport like golf, for example, there's a phenomenon that's been known for a long time called quiet eye, which was Joan Vickers is the one who kind of first coined the term. And in that case, we want to have a very steady vision right before the initiation of our putt or our golf swing, something like that. We want to be held on the right edge of the target point, which is on the edge of the ball. And so we want to have a very long fixation period of time. In a more dynamic environment, we want to have, we want to have more planned visual control, but we're not going to be, we're not going to have these really long fixations, but we want to have some long fixations and some planned visual control, to make better, ultimately to make better decisions about it. So it's very task oriented. It's very task dependent.
I can imagine. Yeah.
Task driven.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Then the article, the eyes have it. I want to try to distill the essence out of it, and you can correct me if I'm
okay.
If I'm just reading it as a non-expert and as a trainer, what I get out of it is that what you see on body-worn cameras or whatever video from an officer is not the same as what officers perceive themselves.
Sure. Yes.
Is it correct, or can you?
Yeah. So yeah, that's the essence of it. Sure. Yeah. So our goal with this paper is, in the United States, body worn cameras, it's becoming fairly ubiquitous with most police departments and everything, and so most officers will have them, and ultimately they've been a positive for, I think largely been a positive for police and police trust between police and citizens and those type of things, although it's not been perfect. And there's a lot of assumptions that are made based on the field of view that you see in a body camera. So what we wanted to try to show and to help everybody to understand is that the field of view that you see in a body camera is going to be missing key pieces of information that the officer is utilizing in a given situation. In this case, in the article, a use of force situation, that they have to utilize to make their decisions in a potentially like deadly situation, potentially high stress situation, a highly dynamic situation, changing situation, that kind of thing. And so, and one where they have to regulate their emotions, and the other parties in the area have to regulate their emotions, and all these factors that are going into it. So we wanted to kind of investigate how those two things differed, because there's a lot of different, when we look at the use of body-worn cameras, and it goes to interpretation, and that interpretation is biased by the individual's perception of police. And so if they have a negative perception of police, they see the body cam footage very differently than if they have a positive perception of police. And, and of course, there's been some articles too that have looked at where you have two cameras involved, like either from a police cruiser and the body worn camera, or like maybe a third camera from like a storefront or something like that. And typically when that happens, the perception changes because they see more pieces of the information that's necessary to make a decision, right? So they see that. So in a sense, we're trying to show that there's some, value difference between what the police officer is processing and seeing and where their visual system is and how much information they're gathering versus the limited amount of information that you see, particularly from a chest worn body camera.
Yeah.
So what we did show is that we showed that just from a practical sense, and frankly, it wasn't, too surprising, but from a practical sense, of course, you have a lot more degrees of freedom in the way your head moves and your eyes move than you do from the body camera. But more importantly, we showed that, if we look at the gaze behavior of the police officers versus like what we called, the information received by the body camera, there was a stark difference between those two things. And particularly for those key moments in our use of force scene that we used in our study, we saw large differences in those factors, and particularly, well, not to spoil it too much, but like particularly when the assailant goes in to retrieve a firearm, in many of the, over 60% of the time, that piece of information was missed by the body cam, around that time, So, whereas the police officer, if we looked at their fixations and where their eyes went, their visual field of view, they would see that, nearly almost like 86% of the time, I think it was the number, almost 90% of the time, they would see that assailant go and retrieve that weapon, or was missed a large percentage of the time. So,
yeah,
I can't.
Were there other difference in what you saw on the body cam versus what the officers' eye movement?
Yeah, so there was a huge difference between those two things, and so they're just such a limited difference, and so we saw overall the number of items so the way the study was designed was we had officers enter into a use of force scenario that we had. They're actually officers from another police department that came and were our actors. And we actually evaluated them on the variability of their performance, and it was very low. So we sent in pairs of officers. So we sent in 2 officers at a time. We told them to behave as their training dictated. So we didn't give them no instructions of what to do or what they're facing. They did get information. We did have a dispatch. So we had them get in a squad car, drive around a track. And as they're driving around the track, dispatch gave them 2 series of dispatches, and they gave them a code 1, and then they gave them a code 3, and they had to drive through a slalom course on their way over to our scenario. And in the code 3, they explained that there was an off-duty officer present, there was an accident involved, and there was a person who had an outstanding warrant for arrest and was very agitated and was making threatening or comments and things like that. So this is what they get from dispatch. So they showed up with some pieces of information to it, and and then they had to make decisions about who was the assailant, and there was a bystander that was getting involved. So we put a lot of variables in there, and the bystander may be someone who could be a potential threat to them. It was kind of unclear at the moment. There was clearly some people who were witnesses. So there was a woman that was involved, there was a witness, and of course there was an off-duty police officer. And so they had these different pieces that they had to process some sort of information about. And when they did that, then they had to scan the environment, make decisions, figure out who was the most threat, where was the most tactical position to go, where was their partner, all these pieces of information. And so then we looked at the scan rates of that, and we looked at how many times and we called them critical pieces of information. We looked at how many times they noted or their visual system landed on that critical piece of information versus how many times was that critical piece of information, received in the body worn camera. And, depending on, the type of critical piece of information, and the ones that were more critical, of course, like the position of the assailant, they had a bat at one time where they put the bat down, picked up the bat. Then they also picked up a weapon and eventually fired the weapon. And then the police officer would have to return fire. And so we looked at those pieces of information, and we compared those between the body cam and what the police officer saw with their gaze behavior. And
Yeah.
you know, and all of those key pieces, critical pieces of information had higher responses than than the body worn camera.
And what is for trainers and what is for, how do you call it, for use of force analysis afterwards? What is for you the key message of this research article?
Yeah, so I might take the second one first. And the key message is, like, so many time now, because the body worn cameras are, like I said, ubiquitous. The thing is to put those out and let everybody interpret it. But I think there's probably to provide some fairness to the police officer, there probably should be, it should be paired with some explanation of what the police officer saw. And you know, clearly there's some legal steps along the way here, but at the very least, we have to put some interpretation when we put out a body camera to make sure that there's some interpretation of what the police officer was dealing with and what was happening at the time of that. Because, you know, that limited view, and oftentimes it can look very, can look pretty bad for the police officer in that sense, but it's just, and a lot of times they're time windowed, so you see a portion or piece of what happens, and that's what released to the public. So there should be some, you know, from an analysis perspective, there should be a very consideration of as much information, including the officer and any other cameras that are available, any kind of pieces of information that are available beyond just the body worn camera, you know, because of that limited view, you know. And it's easy. The thing you have to remember too is it's easy to look back at a situation with introspection and make different decisions, right? So we have to be careful when we think about the people involved. They're making rapid decisions in a high stress environment where, you know, their life may be online, right? So we have to interpret that correctly, you know. And so kind of challenging that sort of analysis of the gold standard of a body worn camera doesn't provide enough information that we need to use.
Yeah. Is that the same what you said in the start, that vision is state dependent? Because for also my colleague here in the Netherlands, Arne Nieuwenhuis, he studied also scan behavior, and he, for example, he found out that under stress, officers perceive distance difference than under no, for example.
Yeah. So, and that has to be taken into account too, in terms of you know, how someone perceives that environment is going to be different on both parties, right? And so that has to be, everything has to be sort of caged in that situation, you know. So if you talk to, you know, the bystanders, their perception is going to be changed because of that, the stress of that environment. You talk to the officer, their perception is going to be changed because of that environment. So it all has to be caged in that, what is going on in that dynamic, stressful situation. So, you know, and you know, frankly, like giving some time to process that, you know, because, you know, we need some time to be able to process what happened, you know. And so we might give a clearer picture in a you know, some period of time after the event rather than immediately after the event, because we need some time to process it. Not that our story is changing or something like that, but just like that idea of introspection, retrospection, and thinking about that what happened and trying to put the pieces together so we can understand what happened in that event, you know.
And even if we had a perfect camera with all the abilities of our own visual system, 100% match. Even then I wonder, it's just a wonder, even then I wonder, then still you don't, I'm not sure if it's true what I'm saying, but my point is that then even then you cannot, you're not embodied, you cannot feel the
So, and you know, to your point, this is one of the reasons why we did a live scenario rather than doing something that's like a video, because there's a lot of work out there where they have watched officers watch a video on a screen, or
Yeah.
now even today they put them in a 3D headset, which is slightly better because at least they have some, 3D depth and distance and field of view changes, those kind of things. But this is why we put them in a live scenario, because we wanted to fully embody what those choices and decisions that they might make in that process. And so that's why we have to look at what their interpretation is of that situation. What was your interpretation at that moment in time? And how did that change? How did that behavior match that interpretation? And so, and of course, sometimes their interpretation of the situation is incorrect, right? And they human and they make mistakes, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times their interpretation is that this was a life or death situation and they had to act appropriately. And these are the factors that contributed to that interpretation, right? So, yeah.
So what we learned is that body-worn camera doesn't tell the whole story.
Correct. Yeah. And we have to be careful of over-interpreting what we see in the body camera.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And does this also have implications for the use of video in training? Because some organizations use a lot of video images, for example, to train situational awareness, to train decision making, that kind of video task. Does this paper have any implications for that?
So yeah, so I would think, so one of the implications it has, in this paper and the other paper you mentioned, I think both tie together in that respect, is that the more integrated we can make training, the better. So video training, and now they have the VR ones and things like that. They give you more reps, right? So that's the benefit of them, that they give you more opportunity to be exposed to that. But there's so many problems with that don't, we always, in my area, we always talk about what's called transfer of learning. So if we're going to do something in the training environment, we want to see that there's a positive transfer to the target context, the context we want to use that skill in. And the closer we can make those two things together, the better we see of transfer of learning. And so we call it specificity of practice or specificity of training. And so the more those two things align up, the better we will be able to utilize those skills in the actual environment. And give you kind of an easy example of this is that when you look at like shooting training, right? And you see that officers will, score above 95% on static targets or even moving targets or dynamic targets. But in the field, there's a couple studies that have been looked at, and their percent hit or miss is something like 18% in one study that was done. So one study was done where the range was something like between 15 and 30%, of actually hitting the target, and it was much worse when live fire was coming at them, and they're trying to return fire, and so the odds that they hit their target is quite low. But all of them train and they can hit a target in a static environment or even a moving target in a range, something like that, at 95%, right? But in the real world, they don't hit the target that well.
Yeah.
So, so this is the idea. So that the more we can have scenario-based training or tactical-based training that's using our visual system as you would use it in the real world, the more likely that's going to have that transfer of learning or that transfer of training process happen.
Yeah. Is there any benefit of doing, I'm not sure how we call it, eye movement training? This is not the right word, but sometimes there are some programs where you have to do a lot of things with your eyes, but.
Right. So the benefit is better if it's task related, if it has context to it. So those kind of things. You can see benefit if someone has sort of a deficit in their visual system and they need help, and to prove that, you will see some benefit with those kind of trainings, that kind of thing. You do see a slight small benefit if we're doing some reaction times training, those type of things, but The biggest benefit you see, and the better way to go at it, is to have some sort of context, have it task related, have it situation related. Those where you see a lot more benefit in how you use vision in that way. And then providing necessary, in the training situation, you need to provide necessary feedback, and that's why having something like using eye trackers and things like that in the training environment, you would be better opt to provide that feedback. Because one of the interesting things we see sometimes is that post interviews, people know where to look. They know what's the right decision. So if you say, "Hey, where was your vision? Where were you looking?" They'll say, "Well, I was looking at that, or I was looking at this," because they know that's where they should be looking, but that's not always the case. Or they don't look at it long enough, or they look at here very quickly and they go look at something else where they should have spent more time over here, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Is this a consistent finding?
It is a consistent finding, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it is consistent. Yeah, to give you another sport example of this is like, again, going back to golf real quick, if you ask a golfer, did they keep their eye on the ball? They 100% will tell you, yes, I did. And some way they're not actually lying, because what happens, like if this is where your ball is, the club face will go back. As the club face comes forward, their eyes start to move, particularly if they're a novice golfer, if they're a beginning golfer, right? And then the club face will hit the ball here, right? And so you say, did you keep your eye on the ball? Well, it's in their visual field. So in some way, yes, they were on the ball, but because their eyes started to move early, they actually are not in the right place where they need to have their vision to effectively hit that golf ball. And they're more likely to miss the putt or hit the ball or something like that, because the vision will drive the rest of their movement. It will actually change because their eyes started to move early. It'll change how their body moves. Right?
Yeah.
So
is there, on basis of your expertise and your field of study, is there for shooting? I mean shooting with time, like doing your certification as a police officer. Is there an ideal way? Is there an ideal quiet eye time? Because also Dr. Lewinsky talks a lot about external focus of attention and quiet eye. And what would your advice be just for regular practice on the range static?
Right. So it's interesting. We just did a study with looking at, and we have ROTC within they're in the university system here, and they go into the Army as an officer, and so they get a college degree and they get training into the military. We just did a study where we're looking at their training and their vision as they're learning how to shoot a weapon. And again, like we talked a little bit about, it's likely curvilinear, so longer is better, but too long would have no benefit or be a negative benefit. So so typically what we see is somewhere in the neighborhood of around 400 milliseconds or so as a quiet eye period. We've seen some articles where it's much longer than that, but typically our work anyway, we saw that it was around, the average was about 450 milliseconds, something like that, of maintaining stable vision right before trigger pull, and typically performance was better at that. It was much shorter. I mean, and like some of the ones that did a lot poorer than that, their quiet eye period was somewhere around 250 milliseconds, somewhere like that, and some even much lower than that, 150 milliseconds, something like that. So but yeah, the ones that we saw that were way more successful, were right around that 450 range, some around 500 sometimes even. But yeah, some period like that.
And does the external focus of attention also fits into this in the sense that looking at a target instead of looking at your whatever gun or a hand or
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, keeping that external focus, maintaining that tension on the target. Something about in all these situations, it's really about looking at the outcome of what the action is you're trying to do. So whatever the outcome of that action is, the more we fixate on the outcome of that action, the more likely we'll hold a steadier gaze for that. Yeah. So so that's what we see.
Certification seems to me, although it's not necessarily a representative task, but what I see in police training, it comes with a lot of stress for officers. So they have enormous difficulty in all those things, in maintaining their external focus and maintaining the gates. I wonder if you use eye trackers in certification. I wonder where their eyes go.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah, to
Yeah.
see. We've done it in a police population. Like I said, we did it in this
Oh, yeah.
ROTC population, which is
Yeah.
and they did vary in experience a little bit because some of them obviously had shot a weapon before they got here, but others had zero, never picked up a weapon ever before they were part of the training. So
Yeah.
so sort of interesting. Yeah.
I will be cautious of your time, of course, but can you just give a how do you call it? An overview of the study gaze control and tactical decision making under stress. It was
Yeah.
also a very how do you call it? Informative article. What was the research goal, and what was the study like, and what can we learn from it?
Yeah, so the procedures were the same as the body cam paper. And in this paper, and what we did, again, was a use of force situation, as I described previously. And the thing that we did in this paper is we wanted to look at, particularly looking at gaze behavior and the vision as driving differences, because we were trying to see who, if we look at it from a performance perspective, an outcome perspective, and better decision making, how did vision drive that process? And so we wanted to see what was the factor that led to better outcomes. And so we used a cluster analysis, and using this cluster analysis based on based on the knowledge that like I described earlier, that the more your eyes move, the less you see. It's, as I mentioned, those kind of counterintuitive. And so if we're under high stress, we tend to narrow that focus. We tend to scan the environment more. We tend to miss key pieces of information. And then, of course, it affects our outcomes, right? And so what we did in this paper is we tried to use this cluster analysis to look at how, if we could come up with different groups of how visual processing that they might have gone through, and then looked at factors that are related to that visual processing. So effectively what the cluster analysis did, which is just a statistical technique, it clustered us into two distinct groups. And when we run like traditional statistics on those two distinct groups, like their saccade behavior, how much their eyes move, their fixation time, fixation duration, how long do their eyes stay still, and what was that period of time, the number of fixations, it makes a clear distinction between those two groups. So the cluster analysis, in a sense, worked, if you will, so we ended up with very distinct groups, and statistically they were distinct on these factors, as you would expect and hope if you have two clarity groups. And then we looked at some of the characteristics that differentiated these groups. And so our sort of argument or thesis was that we created this, what we called like a high scan group and a low scan group. And the high scan group, typically performed worse in the scenario, typically was not in a very good tactical position to react to the use of force, typically, maybe was less in sort of agreement with their partner and where they should be, and they're maybe in two disparate positions and things like that. But in this scenario, by the way, there wasn't necessarily one right answer. There were several different options of ways you could go about the scenario and still come out with a meaningful outcome. And so there was different possibilities. Because it was a live active scenario, there wasn't necessarily there was sort of good, better, sort of better, good, worse outcomes that you have, right? And the high scan group found themselves in, the good to worse categories far more often than the low scan group performed more into the better good categories of where should, better decisions, better outcomes, those kind of things. And one of the things that we saw was, so the officers, of course, are trained that to return fire, but never initiate fire, right? And so we looked at one of the things like response response time to returning fire. And so if you're in a better position and you have made better decisions, you are more likely going to be faster at returning fire, right? So your response time to return fire is going to be lower. And so that's what we found in that low scan group.
Yeah.
The high scan group was, of course, slower in returning fire, right?
Yeah.
And then we saw a number of different other things that differentiated these two groups. And, you know, and the other big thing was the type and kind of tactical training. And so we had a larger percentage, of course, in the one group that was better in military training, had larger percentage of in specialized tactical training in the police force and things like that. So the kind and the quality of training matter.
Yeah.
What didn't matter, I think I mentioned this in the beginning as well, what didn't matter was time on force. Time on force is not actually a factor, right? So like someone, a more experienced officer, wasn't automatically in the low scan group, didn't automatically perform better. So, you know, so it may speak to a little bit of maybe needing some refresher training or like newer training or more modern training, those kind of things. Because some of these officers may have been on the force for a very long period of time, and the kind and quality of training that they received when they went through their academy experience might have been very different than what's done today, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, so there's lots of factors that probably influence why that wasn't a factor in our outcomes, but you know, by and large, the percent in time and quality of tactical training was much more important.
So because there were two groups, and one of the groups had, can you say that, had better visual behaviors and better outcomes.
Right, correct.
And there were a lot of factors like tactical training, which were, no, I'm not sure if causal, but they were influencing this relationship.
True. Yes.
Yeah.
That's, yeah. Yeah.
What is the biggest takeaway? Of course, I know that research is a thing on its own, to develop knowledge. But if there is a applied takeaway from this, what would you say? What is this from this paper?
Yeah, I think the takeaway is to have two things. I think probably is to have more, not more, but well, potentially more, because sometimes it's very limited. Because particularly in the United States, it's sometimes the amount of time that they're in the academies can be very short, right? Particularly when we look at other countries where they sometimes, you know, like in some countries they have 2 years of training. You know, we have 6 weeks of training in some academies. You know, so it's can be very short. So maybe more training, but also training that's more tactically related and in more trying to do more integrated training. So like if we go back to the you know, the shooting on a range, you know, trying to include, you know, scenario-based training where we're integrating multiple skills together, we're utilizing those skills together. And so yeah, what tends to happen a lot of times, or is we train one skill, then we train the next skill, we train the next skill, and then somehow we have to expect that someone's going to be able to integrate all that training together. And we might do a little bit of like where we're integrating that training, and we give a little bit of exposure to that, but we probably need more exposure to that kind of integrative tactical training where we're looking at multiple skills in at one time and trying to utilize multiple skills at one time. So I think that's kind of the big take-home message from this.
And is there a specific way? Is there a specific way, like in training, to develop? Let's hype it up a little bit, to develop superior visual scan behavior. Is there some method to the madness?
Yeah. So the other thing, let me mention one other thing before I answer your question. The other thing that this article also shows us is that if we do control vision, you know, if we have a more planned visual approach, we, you know, even though all the officers had a high arousal response, and so they were their heart rates were up. We got their heart rates up. You know, some were up as high as 170 beats per minute when they entered the scenario. So what we did a really nice job of, and the officers did a really nice job of taking it seriously, because we told them this was like a real situation. We want them to act like it's a real situation. So even though this was a scenario, we were able to raise their heart rate and put them in a stress response, and then had them do things in a stress response. And so knowing that if we control vision as a strategy, then that will mitigate some of that stress response. So we didn't actually see it, like we didn't say those who controlled their vision or who were in that cluster, the low scan group, they didn't actually see a drop in their heart. They didn't all of a sudden drop their heart rate, and because we didn't ask them to do that or tell them to do that. But we saw those, even though they had a stress response, they did better because of the way they controlled their vision. So if we include that into training, and this is getting the answer to your question, is that if we practice that in training, and so we train, and again, probably in a scenario-based training where we are training where to look, when to look, what kind of information to look, then adding that knowledge that if I control my vision, if I am feeling stressed, I am getting response. Okay, let's start controlling my vision a little bit more. That's the focus of my action. Then I'm going to do better in that situation, and I'm going to be less impacted by my stress response. I might not slower my stress response, but I'm going to be less impacted by it. In a sense, going to cope with it better. Right.
Yeah, it seems like there is in Holland there is a professor of sport psychology also talks about this explicitly, also with the quiet eye, that if your visual focus is on the task relevant information, there is no no time for stress or something. But it was a little bit like a joke, but there is some
right. So I agree with that. That's what effectively what we saw in this article is that if the ones that were more focused tactically, even though they had, if you looked at them physiologically, you're like, this guy's under stress, this person's under stress, but that it didn't impact their performance, right? It didn't have this negative, like oftentimes we expect if you're under this high stress state, you're immediately going to have this negative performance, right? But it can be mitigated by the way we control our visual world and by being tactical about our visual, being planned about it, those type of things. And,
is it also possible? Do you think, for example, with stress, there's nowadays we're talking about being aware that you're stressed, so to speak, eh? And if you are aware of it, maybe you can regulate it. Maybe you can also say it about your visual. If you feel a kind of, how do you call it? I'll go all around visual scan behavior, or maybe you're feeling. If you can recognize it, maybe you can become more goal-directed with your visual system.
100%. I think that's absolutely true, right? So if you found yourself like looking around, scanning too much, maybe settle yourself down, try to focus your vision on, and then again, relying back on if you have good quality training, like what are the patterns, what is the key pieces of information I need to be focusing on here? And slow that vision down, right? So
Well, great. We covered a lot of things in just. Did I forget to ask something which is very important to you with regard to this research and police training?
Nothing I can think of. No, you think you did a nice job asking great questions. So
And is there for trainers or maybe even for researchers, do you have some how do you call it, tips for books or articles to read to gain a little bit understanding of the visual system? Of course, these articles, but if you want to have some basic knowledge about visual system performance and stress.
I mean, there are a lot. So off the top of my head, you might look at the model that we referenced in the paper there. Vine and Wilson are the authors who wrote about that. The model that we referenced, and so they would be a good source to look at. And then, of course, like it's kind of an older textbook, but there's a textbook that Vickers wrote and Vision in Action, which is pretty interesting too, as a base. It's a pretty good base art book that people could look into if they're really interested in some of the kind of that's a bit historical now in some of the work that was done, but it's still fairly applicable. in the way we see things today. So.
I'm sorry, this is my fault, but I have to ask you a last question. This is because there is now a lot of how do you call it, a shift from informational how do you call it, information processing approach to ecological dynamics and motor learning. What is the current state of visual research? Is it also more to Gibson ecological dynamics, or is
Yeah,
it
so I would say so. We're doing a lot more in that regard with our work. More, perception action coupling,
yeah,
more like dynamical processing of, information and dynamical systems approach, so on a completely separate, issue, we do look at people with an impaired state, and we'll actually look at how their eyes move, and when they're in impaired state, they have a lot more randomness in their eye movements, and so we actually measure that, some dynamical systems model approach to looking. So yeah, so I see that a bit more than the sort of traditional information processing.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Murray, and
absolutely,
I'm sure we can get a lot of it, and it's also always nice to talk about, because we can read these articles also in For Science, but to have a little conversation about it is very worthwhile. So I will end this video, and I want to say thank you afterwards. So thanks to listening to the podcast, and I hope, as always, that you can learn a lot. If possible, I will put the papers in the show notes or a link to it, and provide some extra information. Dr. Murray, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I will close